All right. So, chapter 3 in this textbook is all about culture and interpersonal communication. I'm setting up the PowerPoint a little bit differently. What I want to do, this chapter is divided into 5 sections, and at the start of each section, I will ask you to be thinking about this as you go through the slides and also as you read the textbook. So, what's the relationship between intercultural dimensions of communication and interpersonal dimensions of communication? So, before we can really understand this concept, we need to talk about the idea of culture, and then we'll talk about co-cultures. Okay, so here's how the book defines it, and they're using Larry Samovar and his colleagues have come up with, that culture is the language, values, beliefs, traditions, and customs that are shared and learned. I like that learned part. All right, and then there's this interesting concept. Well, culture is a matter of perception and definition. What's that mean? Okay, so as the textbook says, when you identify yourself as a member of a culture, you must A, recognize yourself and others as sharing certain characteristics, and B, see others who don't possess these characteristics as members of a different category, right? So it's how you define, whatever the culture is how you define it, and then you perceive who belongs in this culture and who doesn't. Okay, so there are a couple of important pieces of vocabulary that we need to know. Oh, I always jump ahead. Okay, we'll get to the vocabulary in a second. This is showing how the United States has changed over time. It looks at the percentage of foreign-born population living in the United States. So this foreign-born population living here can be citizens, can be resident aliens. Okay, I hate that word, aliens, but that's still what they call it. So you look in 1960, the United States was predominantly, the people in the United States were predominantly from Europe and Canada. Those who were not actually born in the United States. Okay. And then look how, as time has gone on, it's more or less equalized, but Europe and Canada, that proportion has gotten much smaller. I have no idea why in the 1980s there was a dip. You'd think, 100% would be right across. Okay, so that part at the top that's kind of white is other, and I'm guessing the other would be, people probably who were born in Africa or Australia or something like that. So you can see that culture is going to be a big factor in looking at how we communicate. Okay, now the important vocabulary. All right. So we have this term, these two terms, in groups and out groups. And I know people's frequently the first understanding that people have is, well, an in group, that those are if you think about high school, those were the popular kids. No. An in group is any group that you feel that you belong to. And then if you belong to that group, everyone who is not a member, that's an out group. So in high school, you were an athlete. So all of the athletes were part of your in group, and anyone who was not an athlete was an out group. At the same time, people who were, my high school days are very far away. The arty type, anyone who was creative like that, like the people who were involved in plays and musicals, they had their own, that was an in group for them, and the out group was all of you people who maybe were athletes. Okay. Another key term is social identity, the part of the self-concept that's based on membership in groups. When I was a kid, in elementary school, and when you were meeting people for the first time, it was very common to ask the question, so what are you? And the answer that we were really looking for, excuse me, for most of us, it was where our grandparents had come from. you'd say, oh, I would always say I'm Italian, Polish, and Ukrainian, because those are where my grandparents had come from. But you can answer, who are you? And you can look at things like your ethnicity, your nationality. And you could look at, when we get into the idea of co-culture, you can look at your age, your geographical region, physical disability, religion, activity. So co-cultures look at all the different components that make up who we are. And there's a new, not a relatively new idea called co-cultural theory that says that anyone who is a member of a co-culture, especially a co-culture that is not the dominant culture, and the textbook in the focus on research looks at Latinx students. So you have three choices. You can assimilate. So there's assimilation, which means you fit in. Right? You try to dress like the people, you talk like the people, you do whatever the larger overarching culture is doing. You can do accommodation, which is where you do what you need to do, but you keep your own identity. And the book gives an example of, a Muslim woman in the United States who wears her hijab. She goes to work, she does everything that she needs to do, but she keeps her a part of her cultural identity that's very important to her. She hangs on to that, and that's accommodation. And then the last one is separation. And I always think about this with the Hasidic Jews in New York City. I know in other cities too, but there are entire neighborhoods that is, the only people who live there are the Hasidic Jews. So they have chosen not to assimilate or accommodate. They have created their own enclave, their own neighborhood where they keep all of their cultures, the original culture. Okay, so hopefully this is kind of a real general overview of the idea of culture. So I want you to think about, to really personalize this, what are co-cultural groups that you belong to? Are you a bowler? Are you a biker? Are you a a chess player? You Dungeons and Dragons player? You might look at your ethnicity. So just think about all the different co-cultural groups that you belong to, and then think how your membership in any of these groups impacts your communication. And how would you describe the intersection of your most significant categories of identity? This is something I would like us to talk about in class on Wednesday. So really spend some time thinking about your co-cultures and be ready to share. Okay. Now we're going to, this is the second section in the second subsection, I guess, in the first section that looks at intercultural communication. Well, what exactly is intercultural communication? Okay, this is communication that occurs when members of two or more cultures or co-cultures exchange messages in a manner that is influenced by their different cultural perceptions and symbol systems, both verbal and nonverbal. Okay, so, well, what exactly does this mean? Well, let's take a look at some of that. Okay. All right, let me go back to this one. So alrighty, so you are, I would say that I am a member of one of my co-cultures, or I'm interacting with someone who really understands the automobile. And so they kind of belong to a co-culture of either mechanics or car aficionados, and they're talking about cars. They're using words that I don't know at all. And so I'm listening to them and I'm thinking, one, man, they know an awful lot about this, and two, I feel stupid because I don't know this, and maybe so I'm both impressed but also somewhat diminished because our verbal systems are different, and they might be thinking that it's a pity that I don't know more, or how could I possibly not want to know more. So even though we're born in the United States, going to Texas Community College, living in Connecticut, living in the same neighborhood, we are actually members of different co-cultures, and that can impact our communication. It doesn't always. Okay, so there's an interesting word, which is salience, which is the weight you attach to a particular person or phenomena. I tend to use this more as an adjective as opposed to so the noun is salience. I use the adjective a lot more. Salient. How salient is something? How important is it? So they talk about, you have a group of 3-year-olds who are playing in the park, and they belong to different cultures that might not be very important. The different cultures that they belong to really has no impact on the way that they are playing. Okay. It's only maybe later as they get older that they start to realize that there are differences, and that those differences are important. I like the last example the textbook gives us, a husband and wife raised with different religious traditions, and most of the time that doesn't have a big impact. But then when it comes to holidays, I have a good friend who is Jewish and her husband is Christian, and they've what they ended up doing, because they didn't want this to be a big dividing point for them. They celebrate both Hanukkah and Christmas, and they go to his family for one and to her family for the other. So that's how they were able to deal with this intercultural intersection. Phew, that was hard to say. Okay, so what they've done here is they've given a chart where we're looking along I always forget, the x-axis. We're looking at, is it interpersonally significant? So it's low or it's high. So we look at this one. An English-speaking caller requests directory assistance from an English-speaking telephone operator. They really should change this, because I don't even know if they have this anymore. It could be, an English-speaking, someone who speaks English calls customer service and the person speaks English. Okay? That's not really interpersonal. Right? We've talked about that. It's more impersonal. And there's relatively little intercultural significance, so that's why it's low and low. So you could have a parent and a child discuss their changing relationship. Well, that is definitely high in the interpersonal. Pretty much parents and children belong to the same culture. Pretty much. Okay, so that would be relatively low in intercultural. Okay, it's when the culture makes a big difference in communication. The traveler unintentionally violating a custom, or spouses from different cultural backgrounds developing mutual understanding. That's when it becomes higher in the intercultural, on intercultural significance and salience. And then they put right in the middle, able-bodied and disabled employees develop ways to work effectively together. They thought that was smack dab in the middle of the interpersonal and the intercultural. Not exactly sure why on that one. Okay, so last point in this section, I think it's really important to make that what we're doing in this chapter, and actually in all of the chapters, is the authors are making statements, they're making generalizations. They're very careful not to present these as stereotypes. That is why you will see words like most or many rather than all, instead of saying that something is one way. They'll say it tends to be, or in many cases it is this way. So they're really working carefully not to stereotype. Okay, so that's kind of generally. Now, specifically for this idea that intercultural differences are generalizations, cultural practices aren't totally different. As far as we know, there is no culture that when they greet people or when they want someone's attention, they tap on that person's forehead. Okay, that's not how it is. In general, in cultures, when people see each other, they greet each other. Whether they use a handshake or they bow or they do that European kiss on the cheek, that's different. But every culture has a way of greeting each other. Very interestingly, I think that greater differences can exist within cultures than between cultures. And the textbook has a diagram of two circles that overlap, and they say, for example, the United States is overall relatively on the formality scale is relatively low. We tend not to make a big difference between people who have higher status than we do. There are other cultures where they are much more towards the high formality, where society is definitely hierarchical, and there are people who are in a different level, so you treat them differently. But when you put one culture overlaid on the other, you see there can be someone in the U.S. who is more formal and someone in another culture who is less formal have more similarities with each other than they would with other people in their culture. I feel like I'm not explaining things well today at all. Okay, and this last point, generalizations don't always apply. Well, yeah. So this really gets to my point that we're making generalizations, and if you read in the text or hear something that I've said, and you say, well, that doesn't apply in my case, that's fine. We understand that there are always individuals within any culture and the generalizations don't apply. But generalizations help us make sense of the world. And as long as we are careful not to stereotype, we should be okay. All right, so this is the end of the first section. I am going to pause the recording.